This section is on natural selection and action, and we will talk about genetic variation and environmental factors that affect evolution by natural selection. We'll define the terms adaptation, reproductive isolation, and separation, and how they can produce new species, and we'll talk about extinction and the things that cause it, namely when the adaptations that the species has does not help it survive when the environment changes. So first, let's take a look at changes in populations. In order for natural selection to occur, and natural selection is the mechanism of evolution, first of all, the population must have a variety of traits. So it has to have different traits. Now remember what traits are. Traits are different features of the same part of the organism. For example, brown fur, black fur, white fur, yellow fur, those are all different traits. And so these traits are determined by the genes or genetic variation within the population. So the population has to have a number of different traits. Now the genetic variation of the population is how much the individuals differ genetically. So if you look at the DNA, how different is the DNA among the different members of the population? The greater the genetic variation, so the greater the difference in the DNA, then obviously the greater the range of traits. So if the DNA between the organisms is different, then you're going to see different traits within that population. Now, populations that have high genetic variation, so there's the organisms, their DNA is fairly different, are more likely to have some individuals with favorable traits. So because their genetic makeup is different, you might have some organisms that are better adapted to their environment if the environment changes. Populations with low genetic variation are less likely to survive changes in the environment. The reason for that is because if they have low genetic variation, they're pretty much all the same. So if there's a change in the environment and one of the organisms can't survive in that change, then the others won't either because they don't have any differences. But if there's differences and there's a change in the environment, then one organism that has slightly different traits than the other may be more likely to survive. Now, environmental factors help determine whether the trait is favorable for survival or unfavorable. Environmental factors are the conditions in the environment that affect the organisms that live there. So different environmental factors might be temperature, amount of rainfall, amount of sunlight, in anything else in the environment, maybe the introduction of new other organisms into that environment. And so an example might be that if you have an environment that's green, so you're in a place that has lots of plants and you are a bird, then green feathers might be a favorable trait because predators wouldn't be able to see you because you'd be camouflaged. In a brown environment, on the other hand, these green feathers might be an unfavorable trait because then you'd stand out and the predators would be able to see you. So where do new species come from? And new species come as a result of a process called speciation. So the formation of new species as a result of evolution is called speciation. Now, the first step in speciation is some sort of separation. So you have a population of organisms and a small part, well, it doesn't have to be small, but a part of that population becomes separated somehow from the rest. So they're no longer in contact with the rest of the original population and can no longer interbreed. Now this separation might be caused by changes in the environment. So you might have a newly formed canyon, so some of the population is on one side and some on the other, or a newly formed lake, or a new mountain range, and that would separate the different parts of the population. So let's watch a little animation to explain this.
Geographic isolation is the physical separation of populations of organisms. Populations may become separated by a newly formed canyon, a mountain range, or a body of water. Any barrier that keeps members of one population from coming into contact with another population isolates those populations. This population of rabbits has an equal number of members with gray fur and with brown fur. When a river dramatically and permanently changes course, however, a small population of gray rabbits is stranded on a newly formed island. Somehow they manage to survive, But over many generations, the descendants of these island rabbits begin to exhibit unique characteristics, such as an increased ability to tolerate drought and slightly larger ears to help them stay cool. Given enough time, the two populations of rabbits may become so different that they can no longer interbreed. If this occurs, they are then considered to be two separate species.
Okay, so that gave an example of speciation. So once the two groups of the original population are separated, the next step in forming a new species is adaptation. So natural selection continues to act on the different groups. So natural selection acts on the group that's in the original environment and also on the separated group. Now, if the environments are different for the two groups, so in the example that we just saw with the rabbits, the island had less water than the other side of the river, and so if the environments are different for the two groups, they will evolve different adaptations. So the way that happens is the rabbits on the island, through genetic variation, there may be some individuals that are better adapted to handle having less water. So just because their genetic makeup is different, those who can best survive a drought will survive, and then their offspring will survive, so they will be better able to survive a drought. So those are the adaptations that would occur for their unique conditions. Now, if there are no individuals that are able to survive in the new conditions, then the population won't survive and they will become extinct. So, for example, let's say you have two groups of birds that became separated from each other on different islands. And the two different islands have different kinds of seeds. Then the birds who have the beaks that most are able to eat the seeds on the new island are the ones who are going to survive. And so that would be the adaptation to survive on that island. The next step in speciation has to be reproductive isolation. So we said that the two groups were separated, and because they are separated, then there's reproductive isolation. What that means is the individuals in one group do not interbreed with the individuals of the other group. If they did, then they would just continue to share their genetic makeup, and there would not be the difference between the two. But since they are reproductively isolated, then they can't share their genetic makeup, and the two groups will eventually end up having different genes. And so at this point, if they are reunited, they may no longer be able to interbreed if enough time has passed and their DNA has changed enough. If they can't interbreed, then we say they're different species. So that is a definition of a species, is a group of organisms that can interbreed. So if they can't interbreed, then they're now different species. So here's a very common example that is shown a lot of, is the evolution of the Galapagos finches. So this is something that Charles Darwin noted when he was on his expedition with the Beagle, the name of the ship. So originally, you had some finches from the mainland of South America, and they left the mainland somehow and landed on one of the islands. So that was separation from the original population on South America. These finches then reproduced and adapted to that environment. So that's adaptation. So the ones that were most fit, meaning most able to survive and produce offspring on that island, passed their adaptations on to their offspring. Now from that island, some finches flew to a separate island, so we had separation again. Now on the new island, those finches reproduced and adapted to the second island's environment. So there's another example of adaptation. So we have different adaptations on the different islands because the environments are different. Now, after some period of time, some finches from the second island flew back to the first island, but because they had changed so much, they could no longer interbreed with the finches there, and so they are now reproductively isolated from the finches on the first island. So this process could have occurred over and over as the finches flew from island to island, and you ended up with different species on the different islands. So what happens if individuals can't adapt to the new environment? So if you have environmental factors changing, then the populations may be able to evolve and adapt to their new conditions if there are some individuals that have traits that allow them to survive with these new environmental factors. But if the environmental factors change drastically, then the populations may not be able to adapt because you might not have any individuals that have any genetic traits that they can pass on to their offspring that help them adapt. Then the species can become extinct. Extinction is when all of the individuals of a particular species have died. So one thing that can cause extinction is increased competition. So if the resources needed for survival become more scarce, competition increases for the remaining resources. So for instance, if the food source runs low, then the individuals are competing for whatever food is there. If some individuals have an advantage in getting the food, then they will survive and pass their traits on to their offspring. If that's not the case, then eventually they will all die out. So if resources such as water, food, or shelter, or space become so scarce that none of the individuals of a species are able to survive, then the species may become extinct. Another thing that might happen is new predators. So sometimes a new predator moves into an area or is introduced by humans. So this has happened when humans have moved to an area where there were not humans before, and they have brought organisms with them that the species that lives in that place were not adapted for. So an example you can see in your book is people brought foxes to an area where there hadn't been foxes before, and the organisms who already lived there didn't know how to deal with foxes, and so the foxes killed them all and they went extinct. So it is possible that when a new predator comes to a region, the prey populations may not have the necessary adaptations to escape the new predator, and then the new predator may cause extinction for the species that can't survive.